Good afternoon. My name is Daniele Capezzone. I write for the Italian paper La Verità. In my previous life, as it were, I happened to chair two parliamentary committees at the Italian Chamber of Deputies. First of all, let me thank the Associazione Guido Carli and the Heritage Foundation for this opportunity to share ideas and views. The title of our meeting is The New Global Order, the World as It Will Be, US, UK, Europe. It is an honor and a pleasure to introduce the organizers. On the one hand, Federico Carli, chairman of the Associazione Guido Carli, and on the other hand, Riccardo Casale, government relations specialist, and our guest speakers, Nile Gardiner, who is the director of the Heritage Foundation's Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. He was named one of the 50 most influential Britons in the US by the Daily Telegraph. He is a leading authority on transatlantic relations. He has written for so many leading publications. He was foreign policy researcher for Mrs. Thatcher, and he also assisted Lady Thatcher with the latest book. Lamberto Dini was the Italian Prime Minister from 1995 to 1996. He also served as Treasury Minister and Foreign Minister, and during his career as an economist, he also served at the International Monetary Fund and at the Banca d'Italia. So the first one to take the floor is Federico Carli. Please introduce this webinar.
Thank you very much, Daniele, for your introduction. We are really honored for having such a distinguished speakers with us today, and we are honored to make this webinar together with Heritage Foundation. It's really a privilege for us. Associazione Guido Carli is named after one distinguished Italian economist who served for many years in the Italian administration. He has been Minister of Foreign Trade, Governor at the Bank of Italy for 15 years, President of Confindustria, the Entrepreneurs Association in Italy, member of the Italian Senate, and Treasury Minister. As Treasury Minister, he signed the Maastricht Treaty, and as Governor of the Bank of Italy, he established strong relations with his American counterparts, particularly McChesney Martin, the famous governor in the 60s. And once another very important and brilliant American economist, Paul Volcker, referred to Guido Carli as one of his heroes, because he really spent many years in trying to pursue the international cooperation and spent many efforts for the good working on the international monetary system. So he was an expert of the international finance. This is why Associazione Carli decided to launch a cycle of seminars for putting a light on what's happening in the world order. I mentioned just three important facts. One is, of course, this coronavirus crisis, which is affecting the world order. A second important fact is Brexit. And in autumn, we will have the American elections. So how the world look like in a few years from now. I'm absolutely convinced that the relations between Italy and the US, Europe and the US, will continue to be vital for both sides of the Atlantic. But I'm really eager to know the view of Mr. Lamberto Dini and Mr. Gardiner this evening. This is why we are absolutely pleased to have you with us this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on which side of the ocean you're currently on. As Federico said, we welcome you guys all to our first webinar of hopefully many today, discussing an interesting topic of new global order. So my name is Riccardo Casale, or Richard Casale, as known by my American counterparts. I'm a visiting fellow here at the Associazione and a former government relations associate for the Heritage Foundation. So I'm very happy today to take part of the collaboration between these two organizations. I would like to thank Federico again and the team for setting up this webinar. And of course, a big thank you to our guests and our moderator, Daniele. Thank you guys all for being here. And of course, for everybody watching at the moment. For those of you who do not know about the Heritage Foundation is one of the most influential think tanks globally, ranked #1 for impact on public policy, located in the very heart of Washington, D.C. The Heritage, from its very beginning, has been on the forefront of policy innovation and impact, formulating and promoting conservative public policies. Heritage is frequently the go-to organization for ambassadors, members of Congress, senators, and of course the White House for conservative public policy solutions. And I know we heard a brief background on Dr. Nile Garner, but furthermore, so Dr. Nile Garner is the director of the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation and the leading authority on Brexit. Before joining Heritage, Dr. Garner served as a foreign policy aide to Lady Thatcher, assisting her with her final book, as mentioned, and advising her on a number of international issues. His work for Lady Thatcher helped shape her foreign policy vision, including her powerful call for Great Britain to consider leaving the European Union, which laid the foundations of Brexit over a decade later. Dr. Garner is a prominent expert in US-British relations, US foreign policy, and transatlantic alliance.
And now, the first question is for Mr. Gardiner. What about the post-coronavirus recovery? Are we going to witness a V-shaped recovery, strong one, or an L1 recovery, that is to say, a feeble one? When he was summoned in the Houses of Parliament, Lord Mervyn King, the former governor of the Bank of England, used to say, "I cannot make predictions, I don't have a crystal ball at hand, I can only outline scenarios and prepare a coping strategy." Please help us outline some scenarios.
Well, firstly, it's a great pleasure to be here today, and thank you very much for the extremely kind invitation to be part of this discussion today. It's an extremely important moment in history, I think, on both sides of the Atlantic, and the question you ask is an extremely timely and an important one. And at the Heritage Foundation, we recently actually put out a major proposal for a transatlantic economic partnership recovery plan, and it's certainly our view that we need to see as swift an economic recovery as possible on both sides of the Atlantic, and that economic recovery has to be based upon the principles of economic freedom, free trade, and economic liberty. And it's certainly my view, I think, that the world can make a very swift recovery from the coronavirus, provided that we do not move back into the protectionist mindset, provided that we move forward actually with policies that actually liberate markets, that advance free trade, that advance economic liberty. And part of our proposal at the Heritage Foundation is to fully support the advancement of a US-UK free trade agreement. We believe that will be a force generator for economic development, for job creation in both the UK and in the United States. We're also in favor of a robust, strong US-EU free trade deal, but this has to be a trade deal that is based upon the principles of free trade rather than economic protectionism. And it's also our view that in both the United States and across Europe, governments have to create the conditions for job regeneration, create the conditions for companies to be able to operate freely without huge amounts of red tape and regulation. So I'm personally optimistic about the economic outlook for both the United States and for Europe post-coronavirus. It's going to be a very tough, difficult few months. It could be a difficult couple of years ahead of us, but we must always, I think, keep our faith in free markets. We must keep our faith in the capitalist system, and we must not embrace the siren call of big government that some European and American leaders are calling for this time. We have to free the markets from the shackles of big government intervention, and we have to allow the markets to work effectively to create the jobs that we need on both sides of the Atlantic. So I'm certainly in the positive camp with regard to economic recovery. I think we're seeing already a very strong economic recovery beginning in the United States. The jobs numbers last week that were released in the US were very, very strong. So I do think we have the foundations for a very, very strong economic recovery. But let's advance policies that support the principles of economic freedom, economic liberty, and free trade.
Thank you, sir. And now, President Dini, it's up to you to answer the question. What's your feeling and what's your view of the post-coronavirus recovery? We hope so.
Now, I've listened with interest to Mr. Gardner and his remarks. I can certainly agree with him that it will be a big mistake if countries move to protectionism. And the importance of free markets, freedoms, free enterprises, etc., create job regeneration and others. I would agree with him, but I'm a little bit less optimistic as to the time that will be necessary to reactivate the economies of our countries, that is to say, to have a swift recovery. Now, Dr. Gardner mentioned that there has been an improvement in the United States labor market, a reduction of the unemployed and so on. But keep in mind that the opening of the economy has been accompanied by a new wave of coronavirus infections in dozens of the American states. And the risk is that the number of deaths will continue to rise. Today, there are 130,000. Dr. Fauci thinks maybe there will become 200,000 before October or November. And the fact that the sharp increase in the number of the infected persons will oblige governors to close down somewhat what these openings that have been wanted by President Trump has been pushing hard for the reopening of the American economy, pushing states and governors of the states and so on, trying to increase the chances of his re-elections. That has been all his action that has been doing so far. But I'm not so optimistic. It will take more than 2 years before maybe we'll come back to have a good economic growth in our countries. I'm speaking of Europe at this point. And to reach that recovery, of course, maintain free markets. By the way, the European Union abide very much to those principles. So there is no possibility of introducing protectionism in Europe, in the European Union. But at this point in time, the governments will have to intervene heavily to produce investment and jobs. Otherwise, that recovery will not happen by itself. These are, let's say, my reactions to what has been said so far.
Okay.
And in point of fact, I'm worried very much also the situation in my country, in Italy, seeing the sharp drop in the growth of the economy, it's the recessionary loss of GNP of 10–12% this year with some recovery next year. And the social situation, we don't know how it will develop, you know, with so many people have lost their jobs and they have to be sustained by government's handouts at this point in time. So let's hope, but the picture doesn't look very good for the time being. It doesn't look very good for Europe. I don't think it looks very good for the United States. On this of the United States, or what is happening there, we can discuss is a different chapter. We may want to discuss also that. Final point that I make, you talk as a main subject of this discussion, the new global order. Now, the new global order will not happen by itself. By itself, we will have disorder. The new global disorder. That's what we are risking. But we may discuss this at a later time.
Okay. Thank you, Lamberto Dini. Let's go back to Nile Gardiner and let's talk about what President Dini was touching, global order or global disorder. What about these tense dialogue, this tough confrontation between Washington and Beijing? There is this well-known quotation from Professor Graham Allison about the Thucydides trap. What do you think will happen? And my question as a European, do you face that the EU may refuse to pick sides, undermining the transatlantic alliance?
Thank you, and thank you also for Prime Minister Dini's comments just now. With regard to the issue of Washington and Beijing, this is without a doubt, I think, the biggest foreign policy matter of today, actually. And the clash between the United States and China, I think, is the single most foreign policy issue right now. And it is certainly my view that the COVID-19 pandemic has been a wake-up call, actually, for the world with regard to China, to Chinese aggression, to Chinese intentions. My view is that China's handling of the coronavirus pandemic has been absolutely appalling. It has been a real disgrace. And we now have a very clear picture of how China, in the early days of the pandemic, deliberately underplayed the extent of the virus, did not reveal to the world what was happening for several weeks. And also, it's clear that China attempted to try and bully the World Health Organization into downplaying the early extent of the virus. There's a lot of controversy with regard to how the World Health Organization has kowtowed to China. And in addition to that, of course, China has attempted to blame the West for the origins of the virus, which is a complete and utter lie. It's very clear that COVID-19 emanated from Wuhan province in China. And so China's actions since the beginning of the outbreak have been absolutely disgraceful. And since then, China has been even more aggressive on the international stage, especially with regard to Hong Kong. And China's threatening actions towards Hong Kong have been absolutely appalling. This is an extremely dangerous situation whereby China is completely going against the 1984 international agreement between the United Kingdom and Beijing, the Sino-British Declaration of Agreement of 1984. And China has no interest whatsoever in respecting international law. China is suppressing now the freedom of over 7 million people in Hong Kong. And I think that we are in a very, very dangerous and precarious situation whereby China is asserting more and more aggressive actions internationally, and it is vital that the United States and the free world stands up to Chinese aggression. And it's certainly my hope that the European Union and Europe as a whole will stand with the United States in confronting Chinese aggression. But so far, we have seen the EU adopt a policy of appeasement towards Beijing, even self-censoring an EU report into Chinese disinformation. And we have to see European leaders standing up to China. We have to see European leaders standing with the United States in the face of Chinese aggression. And so it is important that Europe and the United States stand together in the face of the Chinese threat.
Thank you, sir.
Yes.
President Dini, it's up to you to answer the same question. What about this potential clash between Washington and Beijing?
Now, I don't think there is anyone that can disagree with the comments that Dr. Gardner has made about China's attitudes and so on. I think we all agree on this. And concerning a new global order, it will emerge as a result of policy attitude of the main stakeholders. And what do I mean with this? As of today, we assist to a breakup of globalization as a result mainly of rivalries between US and China. A new order based on three major areas of influence: United States and dollar area, China, part of Asia, and Europe, is what seems to be emerging. But will the world be better off by, let's say, the demise of a total globalization? Maybe it will create, as I said, area of influence, but it will lead most likely to lower growth of the world economy as a result of reduced competition and the spread of innovation that has played such an important role in the growth of the world economy so far. China is aggressive, no question, but we have to be careful because China's reach in the world is so wide that probably it cannot be stopped. Maybe contained, but it's not likely to be stopped.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. And now, if I might, my third question about the relationship between the UK and Brussels and the EU. I'd like to ask Mr. Gardiner what's going to happen in the following months. If I might, I'll say that I see Brexit in an extremely positive way, while the mainstream media, the mainstream politicians in the EU have been regarding Brexit in terms of anathema and superstition. So my question is, will London and Brussels find that they can live as the best possible neighbors, or are they going to clash in the following moments of the Brexit negotiations?
Well, that's a great question, and thank you for your support for Brexit. As you all know, I'm a very strong supporter of Brexit, and it's my view that Brexit is good for Britain, it's good for the United States, but I think it's also a positive development for Europe as a whole. Actually, and I think it will result in a lot of positive change within Europe, and perhaps much needed reforms actually across the European Union as well, with a greater emphasis upon sovereignty and self-determination within Europe. With regard to the UK-EU negotiations, which are being headed by David Frost, who is the Prime Minister's Europe advisor, I think the the negotiations on the British side, as far as the British are concerned, are actually going well. The British have a very positive approach towards the negotiations. They see a trade agreement with the European Union as a big plus, but at the same time, the British are not willing to concede ground to the European Union, and so the position of the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is very clear. Britain is definitely leaving the EU's single market and customs union on December the 31st. It's written into law in Parliament, and so there's no way that the UK will agree to any kind of extension. And I think this reality is now being more greatly understood by EU leaders and officials. They understand that there is not going to be any extension, and that any attempt to extend the transition period is not going to be successful. And so, for the European Union, basically the situation right now is deal or no deal. And clearly it's in the interest of both sides to have a good constructive deal between London and Brussels. But the reality is, if the EU does not want to negotiate in good faith, then there's going to be a no deal full Brexit on December the 31st, which I think is going to hit countries such as Germany, for example, very hard. I mean, Germany exports about 15% of its cars to the UK. Germany is a big exporting country. Many European countries export very heavily to the United Kingdom. It's in the interest of both sides, I think, to have a good deal in place, but the UK is fully prepared to exit, do a full exit without a deal. And so I think the EU has to fully understand this. It's my hope, actually, that the UK can have a very positive, constructive relationship with the European Union in the coming years. But I think EU leaders, especially within the European Commission, have to understand that Brexit is a reality. Brexit is not going to be reversed. You have a British government in place that has a huge majority of 80 parliamentary seats. This is a very strong British government. There is no way that Brexit is going to be backtracked. And it's important for every leader in Europe to understand the new reality that Brexit is not going to be going away. And it's therefore in the EU's interest, I think, to have a positive relationship with Great Britain. But Great Britain is going to be a truly sovereign nation, fully outside of the EU structures. And I think Great Britain will outcompete the European Union with regard to free trade agreements with the United States, with India, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, etc., with countries all over the world. The British have a clear vision of being a global free trading power. And I think this is going to force the EU to make positive changes, less protectionism within the EU, more emphasis upon economic freedom and liberty, lower taxes, and the UK, I mean, no doubt will be a great, economic success story in the Brexit era. And I think that Brexit will be a tremendous success. And I think it's important that the EU understands this reality and that the European Union moves forward in a constructive fashion. And I do hope there will be a very close friendship and partnership between Great Britain and the European Union over the course of the next decade.
President Dini, is it possible to get a constructive deal, as Mr. Gardiner was explaining? And if I might, are the Brussels guys ready to come to terms with the reality of Brexit, or the EU membership has become a matter of religion, if I might?
Well, I think it is an unfortunate situation, because I do think that the separation of the United Kingdom, Brexit, separation of the United Kingdom from Europe, is a lose-lose proposition for both United Kingdom and from Europe itself, I think. In my view, probably, for my point of view, the best solution would have been a custom union, which would have resolved the problem of Northern Ireland and so on. But this is not acceptable to the UK government, because UK wants to regain total sovereignty in its trade policies. A trade union, a custom union would have implied that the United Kingdom would have abide to the rules set by the European Union. And this is not acceptable. And, but no one should forget, not in the United Kingdom, that Europe is certainly the main market for the United Kingdom, European countries. And I must say that there shouldn't be a reasonable agreement before the end of the year. I think we will miss very much the voice of reason on free market and so on, and other attitude concerning the single market, the way the United Kingdom has worked. We will miss the United Kingdom voice in Europe concerning all these matters. Let's hope for the best.
Thank you, President. And now my last question about the presidential elections in the United States. Of course, today is the 8th of July, and it is too early to make predictions. Of course, according to the polls, President Trump may be trailing his opponent, but we all remember what the polls said in 2016. So we should be careful. My question for Nile Gardiner is, as far in your opinion, will President Trump be able to perform as an outsider while being at the White House? Will he be able to enjoy an economic recovery? Will he be able to build on a certain anti-Chinese feeling? Will he be able to play successfully the law and order card? And what about the strategy of his opponent, Joe Biden? Please, Mr. Gardiner.
Yes, those are all very big, important questions. We're just a few months away now from early November to the presidential election. And, you know, 3 or 4 months is a very long time in politics. And so, you know, I think what we are seeing at the moment certainly is President Trump moving from being the favorite in this race, which he was earlier in the year when the economy was doing incredibly well before the outbreak of the pandemic. Now I think that, you know, according to the polls, President Trump's situation is looking a lot tougher. And so he has moved from the, you know, from the favorite in this race to being the underdog actually in the race. And so I think that it's a reversal of fortune for President Trump, certainly as far as the polls have gone, and it's a much bigger challenge now, I think, for the president. But as I mentioned earlier, I think that, you know, we still have 3 or 4 months to go. Anything can happen during that time. I think there'll be several big issues in this presidential race. I think the most important single issue, certainly for the American people, will be the economy. And I think the outcome of the presidential race will depend heavily upon the speed and the extent of the economic recovery. What we have seen over the last few months, since the coronavirus hugely hit the United States back in March and April, has been a massive increase in unemployment. A large number of Americans have lost their jobs. We're now starting to see the beginning of an economic recovery. I think a big question is whether we are going to see that economic recovery moving at full speed in the next few months. It certainly looks as though we are seeing the beginnings of an economic fight back. That certainly, I think, is very helpful for President Trump. But I think there's certainly a great deal of economic concern at the moment for American voters. So I think the outcome of the election will be perhaps very heavily dependent upon the speed of the economic recovery. I think, you know, secondly, in the United States today, we're in the midst of what is a very big cultural war. deal of civil unrest over the last in America.
Yeah.
I think the battle lines are forming on the cultural wars here, and there's a very sharp divide between the Republicans and Democrats with regard to the issue of statues and monuments in the United States, and a lot of Democrats are supporting the removal of statues across America, including statues of Christopher Columbus, for example. You've seen some Democrats who are supporting even a discussion about taking down the statues of the founding fathers, Washington, Jackson, for example. And so the Republicans are fighting tooth and nail, of course, to defend American history, American culture, American traditions. And so you see this tremendous fight over America's history, of America's past, and that, I think, actually is shaping up to be a very big issue in this general election. And certainly President Trump, I think, is making that a centerpiece of his campaign, whereas the left wing of the Democratic Party is I think, fighting a campaign that is hugely controversial with regard to the taking down of US monuments and so on. So I think that's going to be a big issue. China, how we deal with China is going to be a very important matter in this election as well. And President Trump is fighting a campaign advocating a very hard, tough line against China on the international stage. It remains to be seen how Joe Biden is going to approach the China issue. He hasn't said a lot about China, but I suspect that China is going to feature heavily as well. So this is going to be, I think, a hugely important historic general election on so many fronts. It is a massive clash, I think, of ideologies here between, I think, a president who is very much in favor of free markets, limited government, against an opponent who is much more of a big government politician. And there's a fundamental divide between, I think, the Republicans and the Democrats on economic policy, on cultural policy, and also undoubtedly on foreign policy as well. And we're going to see that play out on China. We're also going to see that play out over issues such as the Iran nuclear deal. It's going to also play out on issues impacting the transatlantic alliance as well. Joe Biden is very much a pro-EU, Euro-federalist politician. President Trump is a Eurosceptic, pro-Brexit figure. And so there's a very sharp divide over the future of Europe, actually, between President Trump and Joe Biden. So I think this is going to be a fascinating race. It's going to have big implications for the future of the United States as the world's superpower. And it's going to be, in my view, a very, very tight race as well. And I think that a lot of the polls at the moment certainly underestimate, actually, President Trump's ability to be able to regenerate and regain support over the course of the next few months. So he's a politician who has often been underestimated in the past, and my sense is the polls significantly underestimate, actually, the ability for President Trump to make this an extremely close race in the next few weeks.
Thank you. President Dini, what's at stake in this presidential race? What's your view of what's happening?
Well, first I must say that personally, I am disappointed by the attitude that President Trump has taken vis-à-vis Europe and vis-à-vis the European Union. Now, it seems to me that going against the European Union, trying to deal individually with the single countries and so on. But Europe is there to stay and is likely to grow through crisis, as it is happening and is demonstrating today. See, and where are the countries that are friends of the United States, if not in Europe? There are very few outside Europe. Europe is really the tradition, the values, and so on that we share with the United States, democracy, freedoms, transatlantic alliance, NATO, and so on. Trump has put into question all this. And I'm, say, disappointed by this, because the United States with Europe represent the West. Trump has weakened the West through his policies and attitude of wanting to impose, I don't know, custom duties of 25% on European cars, on these kind of things. And terrible. I'm disappointed. He didn't have to do this. But of course, we cannot say that he's a strong point of President Trump is foreign policy. You know, what has he attained in foreign policy in his 3.5 years, almost 4 years today? Has tried to embrace dictators, and has been rebuffed in all this. So he is a failure in foreign policy. However, I must say that foreign policy has never been a major factor in US elections. Maybe there will be this year. I don't know, because of China, as Dr. Gardner said himself. But as of today, I think President Trump has lost the elections. A lot can happen in the coming 2 months or 3 months ahead, of course. But he is confronted with a three-pronged crisis, you know. One is the economic crisis. It's true that there has been some gain in employment in the recent weeks, but unemployment remains close to 20 million, if not more. They represent some more than 10% today of people unemployed. There were only 3.5 before the crisis, before the crisis, in other words. So he's confronted with the economic problem. He's confronted with the health problem because of the coronavirus and all the deaths that have, I'm sure, continues to happen. And he's confronted with a racial emergency today, racial emergency. Quindi, how can he overcome these three factors? And with coronavirus has brought out clearly that the United States does not have a national health insurance system. This has become very evident. Is insured, the health insurance is assured by companies to people that have steady employment. But how about all the others? You know, there are 40 million people that have no insurance, and 70 million don't have enough health insurance. Now, these factors will pay, I think, will weigh heavily, you know, on the coming elections. The economy, the terrible, I mean, the Chinese has been terrible in handling the coronavirus, COVID-19, but President Trump has not been any better. You know, think what he has done. You know, saying first that it was like a little flu that will disappear. We have the best scientists, we have the best doctors, and this is something that will disappear shortly. Then he said that we should take anti-malaria pills that to solve, and Food and Drug Administration said that was a nonsense. It is not so. Then he said that citizens should drink detergents, you know, these kind of things. But this is terrible. What are you talking about? I mean, he has been therefore contradicted heavily by scientists, Food and Drug Administration, by others, and the number of deaths keep increasing in the United States. So he is confronted with a very serious elections. I'm not surprised that even conservative groups linked to the Republican Party, they are taking distances, they are distancing themselves from Trump in the coming elections. So let's see how it will go. We don't know how it will be, how better will be Mr. Biden. Mr. Biden is the opposite of Trump in the sense that he's not divisive. He's a person that tries to embrace and reach consensus. And maybe that's what the kind of person that the United States may need today. Let's see how it will go. I think both Mr. Gardner and myself, we have to keep finger crossed because we don't know how it will go.
So we have
Thank
listened to extremely different points of view. Thank you. In the final part of our conversation, there will be room for questions and answers.
Yes.
And I am collecting some questions from our listeners. But before,
yeah, look, I wanted to add one thing.
Oh, sorry, sir.
Today, the United States is a divided country. Look at the people in the streets and manifesting, complaining, against the racial issue that since the death of George Floyd has continuing today. A divided country cannot be the leader of the world. That's the point, important point to keep in mind. The United States was the leader of the world during the last war, when the entire country was behind that war effort. Today, the United States is a divided country. As I said, and I repeat it, a divided country cannot be the leader of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, President Dini. In the final part of our conversation, we are going to have some questions and answers. I'm collecting some questions coming from our listeners. But before, I was wondering whether Federico Casale and Riccardo Casale and Federico Carli have some questions or remarks or comments. Federico Carli, it's up to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Capezzone. Just one question, because I'm very much interested in listening to the question of our audience and to the answers, because the presentations are very, very important and interesting. So just a quick question. The American public debt will probably be reaching 120–130% of GDP. At the same time, the net debt position towards the rest of the world reached the amount of $11,000 billion, which is 50% of the GDP. This net debt position has been inflated by the constant current account deficit in the balance of payment. So my question is for Mr. Dini and Mr. Gardner, of course, whether they consider this debt position and this public debt trend a threat for the American economy, and whether they do consider these also a risk for the international order, because this might be considered as unbalanced between countries. This is my quick question.
Who's going to answer first? President Dini.
Yes. Well, look, this is a good question. The United States has built up a large budget deficit, in particular as a result of the fiscal reform, the tax reform that Trump enacted in 1998, in 2019, excuse me, and so on. And the United States is running a large balance on payments deficit on current account at this point in time. And therefore, it doesn't look strong. But don't forget that the United States has the dollar. And as long as the dollar is the main international currency and reserve currency, people continue to have faith in holding dollars more than holding other currencies. And therefore, I do not expect any financial crisis in the period ahead the next years or the next 2 years. And this applies in reverse because also the United States have a total public debt, federal budget debt over 100% of GNP. If then to that you add the debt of the states, you probably come up to 145, 150% of GNP. But that is not the governing factor at this point, at this point in time, because the monetary policy run by the Federal Reserve, as by the European Central Bank, will provide all the liquidity that the system requires. So there will not be problems, not even in Italy from this point of view, in the couple of years, in 1 year or on the next year or so or more. And the public debt and the balance of payments deficit of the United States are not going to be major factors for a crisis. We do hope instead that Gardner was saying that there may be a swift recovery of the US economy. We wish that this will happen because we all benefit from a strong US economy. Not a strong recovery, not a strong US economy, but not even, and certainly not even a weak, let's say, financial position of the United States in the world. Not for the time being, not for the coming years.
Mr. Gardiner, please, it's up to you.
Yes, thank you. And I'm going to address that debt question in a second, but I just wanted to respond to some of the points made by President Dini earlier in his last remarks and about the big picture on US foreign policy, American leadership in the world. You know, President Dini argued that, you know, the United States is in decline, basically, that US leadership is in retreat, that US foreign policy has been a failure in the last few years. I would argue the opposite. I mean, the United States is not in retreat. The US remains undoubtedly the world's dominant superpower. And while China would like to catch up with the United States and reach America's levels, for example, of military power, America's levels of prosperity as well, China is still decades away from it. I mean, China has the aspiration of also being the world superpower, but China's a long way off from actually achieving that even now. And the United States remains, in my view, unquestionably the leader of the free world. And while there is certainly, you know, it's certainly the case that President Trump is not exactly the most popular leader in Europe and some parts of the world, world leadership is not a popularity contest. And if you look at some of the specifics here, for example, if you look at the emphatic defeat of ISIS in Syria, the fact that ISIS now controls less than 1% of the territory in Syria, this is a big achievement. And this is something that, you know, the Trump administration spectacularly achieved, actually, in the early part of this administration. And ISIS was dealt a huge blow and defeat inside Syria. And while Islamist terrorism remains, I think, a significant threat on the world stage, is nothing like the threat that we faced just a few years ago when Barack Obama was the president, and ISIS controlled huge swathes of territory across Syria and Iraq. So that's a big foreign policy victory for the United States. I would also argue that we have seen the Iranian regime significantly constrained and brought to its knees by US sanctions, and by the fact that the United States withdrew from the disastrous Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA deal, which really was a supreme act of appeasement. And the Iranian regime is much, much weaker today than it was a few years ago. I would also point to the fact, and this is confirmed by the NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, who's made this point on many occasions, NATO is stronger today than it ever has been. more money is being invested in the NATO alliance today than ever before. NATO spending among NATO member states is up in almost every single NATO country, and that includes Germany as well, actually. That has lagged behind defense spending. And so the NATO alliance is actually much stronger today than it was several years ago when President Obama was the president. And also the point about America being a divided country. Yes, America's a divided country today. America has been a divided country for many, many decades. And I've been working in Washington now for nearly 20 years. America was deeply divided in the days of the George W. Bush administration over the Iraq War, for example. America was deeply divided during the days of the Obama-Biden presidency. And yes, America is deeply divided today under President Trump. That's just the nature of a presidential democratic system. And you're always going to see a divide in the United States. You know, as for Joe Biden, you know, it's suggested that Joe Biden is a uniting politician. Well, I have to say, when he was the vice president of the United States, America was deeply divided on ideological lines. And I did not see much evidence of Joe Biden being somebody who believed in uniting America, actually. In fact, the Obama administration was a very, very left-wing presidency. And I think that what you have seen over the course of the last few years is within the Democratic Party certainly has been the further strengthening of the far left within the Democratic Party, with very, very divisive policies. And certainly this election, this presidential election in November, is going to be extremely hard fought, closely fought, and it's also going to be fought upon very deep-seated ideological divisions between free market conservatives on one side and big government socialists on the other, actually. And so there's a very deep divide within American society at this time. And just to address the question on the debt and the deficit, I'm glad you raised that issue because it's so hugely important. The reality is that the United States, like much of Europe, is spending too much money. You know, frankly, you know, on both sides of the Atlantic, we have too much government spending, and that government spending has been dramatically accelerated further since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. We have to rein in government spending. We've got to cut government spending. We've got to cut the deficits. We've got to cut the overall level of. We've got to cut the level of debt, actually. And the United States now is going down the path of Europe. It's an extremely dangerous path, and we have to have, I think, US politicians committing to cutting government spending and reining in the levels of debt, because it's unsustainable. It's going to place a huge burden on the shoulders of the future generations, and it's a very dangerous path. So we cannot see more government bailouts happening in the United States, for example, as the left are calling for today. This would generate a further level of unprecedented debt levels in the United States. It's unsustainable and it has to be ended.
Thank you. So before picking a couple of questions from our listeners, I was wondering whether Riccardo Casale has questions or remarks or comments on what he has listened to. Please, Riccardo.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Yes, I do actually have one question. So the British government is close to announcing that it will phase out Huawei from the UK's telecommunication network. What is the significance of this, and what will the rest of Europe be doing? Will they be following Britain's lead on this?
Thank you, Richard. And that's a very, very important, timely question. So as you may have seen from reports in the British press over the last few days, the British government is very close to making an announcement that it will phase out Huawei from the UK's telecommunications network. This is a big U-turn, of course, by the British government, because earlier this year, before the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic in Europe, the Boris Johnson administration announced that Huawei would be given a 35% stake in the UK's 5G network. And so the British government has completely reversed its position And it's reversing its position really for, I think, a couple of reasons. I think, well, three reasons. Firstly, China's actions over the last few months have been extremely aggressive. There's rising hostility in the UK towards China. Secondly, within the House of Commons, there's been a tremendous rebellion by backbench conservatives against the government over the Huawei deal. And thirdly, there's been significant US pressure on Britain to change its position over Huawei. And Huawei is the subject of very strong US sanctions. And Huawei is viewed as an extension of the basically of the Chinese Communist Party. So Huawei is not an independent operator. It is basically fully controlled by the Chinese Communist government in Beijing. And in my view, the British decision, which should be announced shortly, very shortly later this month, will be a big game changer in Europe. And I expect that Germany and other European governments will announce that they will also give Huawei the boot. And I think this will be the right decision, because I think Huawei poses a significant national security threat to the UK and also to the whole of Europe as well. So I hope that Germany and also Italy and other European governments will follow the British lead and reject Huawei.
And now there is a question from one of our listeners. I'll start with President Dini. A question about Germany. As we are seeing, it's Justin who writes, as we are seeing Angela Merkel receiving criticism from her own parties regarding her approach to China, what do you expect of Germany in its attitude towards Beijing?
Clearly, I do understand that G5 technology has raised questions of security, the way Dr. Gardner has said. This is true, but it's not by rejecting new technologies that the West or the United States is going to win the race for new technologies in the world today and tomorrow. That's not the way. And the next war will not be won by armies, by the new technologies. And supremacy in the new technologies, the United States must be very careful, because at this point, it seems to be falling behind in the new technology. Maybe is ahead of China in artificial intelligence, but is behind in other sectors. And China has the ability to give itself an industrial policy that the United States cannot do because of free market and free enterprise. President Trump cannot dictate to any company what they should produce. This is the key point. So we have to be very careful. I'm not a defender of China, mind you. I do agree, and I am on the side of the West, of our alliance with the United States. We share with the United States the most fundamental values and so on. But I'm worried from what is happening today in the world. And as a two-handed, by the way, I didn't mention the fact that in the United States it's true that with a good economic recovery, President Trump may regain consensus. But let's not forget that last November, when they were held the last elections for the House of Representatives, the US had a strong economy, but the Republicans lost the majority in the House of Representatives. So this is a factor also to be kept in mind for the coming elections. Thank you.
Mr. Gardiner, do you fear that Germany might refuse to pick sides between Beijing and Washington?
Yeah, I think it's one of the most important issues of the day right now for Europe, actually, and how we confront the Chinese threat and Chinese aggression. And I do think that European governments, European leaders have to decide whether they are with the United States and also increasingly with Britain on this issue as well. I mean, the UK has been very hard line towards China over Hong Kong, for example. And I think European governments have to decide whether they wish to side with the US and the UK, or whether they wish to side with China. You can't sit on the fence. You can't have one foot in each camp here. And I think it's interesting that in Germany, if you look at politicians such as Norbert Röttgen, for example, is the chairman of the Bundestag Foreign Affairs Committee. And Norbert is also a leading candidate to become the leader of the CDU and replace Angela Merkel and possibly be the next chancellor. He has been absolutely scathing about China's actions over COVID-19. He has been a huge critic, actually, of the EU's appeasement of China. And it is significant, I think, that you have a politician like Röttgen, who represents the future of the CDU, who is adopting a very hardline stance towards China. And I think that what Röttgen is saying is actually a reflection of where also a lot of German public opinion is as well, where, you know, there's a lot of anti-Chinese Communist Party sentiment in Germany and in many European countries. That is rising. And I think that European leaders, you know, have to decide whether they're going to kowtow to Beijing or whether they're going to side with the United States, the leader of the free world, because you cannot be 50-50 in this battle here. You have to decide where you stand. And I do hope that Germany is going to make a decision to stand with the US and the UK in confronting China rather than appeasing China, which is a very, very dangerous and foolhardy game.
Thank you, sir. The last question is for you again, Mr. Gardiner. We go back to Brexit. And someone asks you whether you fear that Brexit might lead to further divisions between England and Scotland in particular.
Northern Ireland.
Also, yes, also.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and you know, I'm glad you raised that issue because it is an important part of this debate, and you know, it's certainly my view that Brexit does not change the big picture with regard to the future of the United Kingdom. And I think opinion polls, you know, bear this out, that Brexit has not suddenly led to a huge increase in support for Scottish independence. There is still a majority in Scotland who believe that Scotland should remain part of the United Kingdom. We had a referendum vote on this several years ago in Scotland where the Scottish people voted, I think it was 55-45, to remain part of the UK. That actually hasn't changed with Brexit. I don't think Brexit actually accelerates any level of support for Scottish independence. And it's important to bear in mind that if we had another referendum on Scottish independence, say in the next couple of years, and I don't think we will have one because we just had a vote on this a few years ago, and we also have a Conservative government that is not in favour of another referendum on Scotland. But if hypothetically we had a referendum in 2 years' time, and Scotland voted the Scottish people voted to leave the United Kingdom, Scotland would be A, outside of the UK, B, it would be outside of the European Union, C, it would be outside of NATO. Scotland would have to apply to rejoin the EU and to rejoin NATO. And I'm in no doubt, for example, that Spain would veto Scottish applications on both fronts because it would just encourage separatism inside Spain. I imagine that there'll be a lot of concerns as well within Italy for the same reasons about Scotland breaking off from the United Kingdom and then trying to rejoin the EU and the NATO alliance. And so I think Scotland would be completely on its own. Also, Scotland benefits greatly from being part of the United Kingdom for economic reasons, for other reasons as well. And it would be a huge leap into the dark for Scotland to leave the United Kingdom, a very dangerous step for Scotland. I don't think there's a popular support in Scotland for that. And I don't think Brexit actually changes the big picture that that a departure for Scotland from the United Kingdom would have huge risks for Scotland's future economically, and also in terms of its own ability to defend itself, national security issues as well. So, I don't think Scotland's going to be going anywhere soon. And also, it has to be said that, you know, Nicola Sturgeon, the Scottish National Party, have done a very bad job actually of running Scotland. And I think that if you want to look at, you know, how Scotland would be a disaster as an independent country outside of the United Kingdom, look no further than Nicola Sturgeon's, you know, disastrous running of Scotland as Scotland's First Minister. It hasn't been a very good example to set. So I very much doubt that Scotland will be breaking off from the United Kingdom in this decade or the next decade or the next few decades, actually. I think Scotland's place belongs as part of the United Kingdom. Scottish membership of the UK benefits the Scottish people. And I expect that Scotland will still be part of the UK for many decades to come. The same goes for Northern Ireland as well. I don't think Northern Ireland is going to be breaking off from the United Kingdom either.
Thank you. It has been an exciting conversation, but unfortunately, I'm afraid our time is over. Let me thank the Associazione Guido Carli, the Heritage Foundation, the organizers Federico Carli and Riccardo Casale, our guest speakers, Lamberto Dini and Nile Gardiner. Thank you for your time and for what we have learned listening to you. So thank you once again and goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.